Helen Wilcox peered from her motionless carriage at the clock on the steeple of Grace Church and took a deep breath. It was noon. 6 ladies would be arriving at her house on West 26th Street in half an hour for a luncheon to meet her elder daughter, Jemima. 6 powerful ladies, the women who would decide whether Jemima would be invited to attend the highly exclusive dancing classes in the fall. Helen came from a family with deep roots in New York society, but the committee was known to be quixotic, eager to pounce on slights and improprieties. And here Helen sat, trapped in the chaotic traffic of 4th Avenue as it inched toward Union Square. No experienced New York City hostess chose to run an errand the morning before she entertained guests to luncheon. But to Cook's horror, the rhubarb custard hadn't even begun to set, so after a hasty consultation, Helen had set out in the carriage to the French pastry cook's shop downtown. She now sat with a box of millefeuille on the seat beside her, counting down the minutes until her guests were due to arrive. She rapped on the hatch in the roof of the carriage, which flipped open. The coachman, Morrison, peered down at her. "Yes, ma'am." "Don't you think 5th Avenue would be better? I'd hate to be late for my own guests." "Maybe so, ma'am," Morrison answered. "Never worry. I'll get you home in plenty of time for Miss Jemima's luncheon." The hatch closed and the carriage turned westward on 11th Street. As they finally turned north and the horses eased into a trot, Helen heard a shout followed by a brief burst of invective from the carriage box as the vehicle came to a sudden stop. Morrison had originally been a groom in the Wilcoxes' wagon stables, and his salty language sometimes reflected it. The hatch opened again. "Beg pardon, ma'am. Only a big dray cut in front of me all of a sudden. We'll be moving soon. Roadwork's ahead, but traffic's moving beyond." "Thank you, Morrison," Helen said before he had a chance to go on. In most well-managed households, servants like Morrison were unobtrusive. But Joshua had never bothered about formality, and Morrison had been one of her husband's first employees. Helen gazed out the window at an immense hole in the cobblestone roadway, from which a pickaxe emerged rhythmically while the carriage inched past. She should never have tried to go down to the village to replace the ruined dessert, but she'd wanted every last detail to be just right. The streets of New York were always clogged with carriages and wagons and pedestrians and barefoot urchins. Joshua had grumbled so often about the traffic that Helen no longer heard his complaints. But she felt a new sympathy for him. After all, he ran a freight transport company. More traffic meant fewer deliveries, and thus had a direct effect on the Wilcox family's household budget. But according to Joshua, the congested streets had also created an unexpected opportunity. Over a year earlier, he had turned to her at breakfast and proudly announced his purchase of an elevated railroad. Just like that, as if he'd bought a new horse. It turned out to be a single engine with one car, running on an iron track 30 feet above 9th Avenue. According to Joshua, it sped between Day Street downtown, all the way north to 29th Street, or vice versa, in a mere 20 minutes. If only she could travel a similar distance with such speed, Helen thought, she'd be at home with plenty of time to reap in her hair, check the flowers on the table, and reassure Jemima, in whose honor the luncheon was to be given. It was rare for Helen to think of the elevated with such enthusiasm. In the past year, it had exerted an endless drain on Joshua's attention and the family's finances. It seemed to drink money, Helen thought. New track, new cars, the absolute requirement to expand. Of course, she wanted it to be successful, and not just for the money. She loved her husband and wished to see his ambition fulfilled. But the risk! He was attempting something that had never been done before in New York, and if it failed... Helen could never complete that sentence, even in her thoughts. The prospect was simply too frightening. Besides, Joshua had assured her that if the elevated succeeded as he expected, Helen could stop worrying about money and instead enjoy what it could purchase. But the rosy future her husband had sketched for Helen a year earlier had not yet materialized. Joshua now had 3 partners, each of whom had been obliged to pour thousands of dollars into the elevated. There had been no accurate way to forecast the expense of extending and reinforcing the track above New York streets because it had never been done before. In the event, the process required not only vast sums of money, but also engineers, architects, lawyers, permits, and cooperation from the city government. Like any groundbreaking enterprise, the project met with untold setbacks that Helen had heard about in detail, occasionally to well beyond the point of boredom.